In today's math lesson, we're going to solve a system of equations using substitution. There's a pretty friendly series of steps to solve a system of equations with substitution. Let's find out what they are. The first step is to determine which equation is solved for a variable. And if you don't have one that is solved for a variable, so that the equation is either x equals or y equals, then you need to solve one of those equations for a variable. After you've found your equation that solves for a specific variable, you're going to circle the equation part of it. The second step is to plug the circled equation from step 1 that we did up here into the other equation for its variable. So if that first equation that is circled was an x equals equation, then you're going to replace the x in the other equation. If your circled equation from step 1 was a y equals equation, then you're going to replace the y in the other equation with that circled piece of information. Step 3, you're going to solve the new equation from step 2 for its variable. And you're going to get an actual number answer. Now, hint, if you have a graphing calculator, then you can use NSolve, or maybe something similar to that on Symbolab. There's several programs out there that'll help you solve, or you can do it by hand. Step 4. So we have gone through steps 1 through 3, and that got us half of our final answer. Step 4 begins the second half of the solving process. You're going to plug the answer, the number answer that you got in step 3, into your circled equation all the way back from step 1. Step 5. You're going to solve that new equation that you just created in step 4 for its variable, and you will get another numerical answer. This is the second half of the solving process. Our sixth and final step is to use your answers that you got from step 3 and step 5 to write your final answer as a coordinate point in the regular XY order. Let's practice. Example 1. We're going to solve using substitution the system of 6x plus 2y equals 2 and y equals 7. Let's walk through the steps of solving together. Our first step was to determine which equation is solved for a variable. Well, we see here that our second equation is a y equals equation. So it is solved for the variable y. And we were instructed to circle its equation part. And its equation part is very small, very simple. That's a 7. The second step is to plug this circled equation part from step 1 into the other equation for its variable. So since this is a y equals equation, I'm going to plug this 7 in for the y in the other equation. Let's see what that looks like. So we're going to replace this y with a 7 right there. Okay, so now step 3 tells us that we need to go through the process of solving for the variable that's still in our equation. And you might use NSolve, or you might choose to solve it by hand. Either way is just fine. I'm going to solve it by hand. Let's see what we get. 6x plus 2 times 7 equals 2. Well, that would make 6x plus 14 equals 2. Subtracting the 14 on both sides of the river, 6x equals negative 12. Divide by 6, and x equals negative 2. We have now just completed the third step of solving for one of our variables. Now, normally we would go forward and we would decide that we needed to solve for y by replacing the x value, the x in our y equals equation, with the -2 that we found. But there is no x in this second equation, so there's no point in going any further. There's nothing else to do. As a result, we can go ahead and get our final answer. And our final answer is going to always be in XY format. Our x was -2, and we were given the y value of 7. And there you go. Example 2, we're going to solve the system using substitution of 3x minus 2y equals -17 and x equals 1. Let's start solving this system by walking through the steps from the introduction. The step 1 was to determine which equation is solved for a variable, either x equals or y equals. And we see again our second equation happens to be solved for x. So we are going to follow the instructions of circling the little equation part from that particular full-sized equation. And we know from step 2 in our introduction that we are going to replace the x in the other equation with this circled 1. And we know that because this is an x equals equation, so I have to replace the x in the other equation. Let's see what that looks like. So our first equation becomes 3 times 1 minus 2y equals -17. Let's start solving for y as we are instructed in step 3. 3 times 1 is 3 minus 2y equals -17. Let's subtract 3 to the other side of the river, giving us -2y equals -20. We'll finish this off by dividing both sides of the river by a -2, and thus y equals +10. Great, we've done all the hard work. Let's finish off this problem. We know that we were given x equals 1. So I don't have to go back and solve for a value of x. Thus, we can skip steps 4 and 5. So our final answer will be always in order from x to y with a point of 110 as our final solved solution. And there you go. Example 3. We're going to solve using substitution the system of y equals 10x minus 6 and y equals -4x plus 8. From our introduction, we learned that we should begin this process by looking for an equation that is solved for a variable. Well, don't you know it? Both of these equations happen to be solved for y. That makes this actually really simple, not scary at all. So we circle up one of these equations. Truthfully, it does not matter which one. I chose the second one. And we are going to replace the y in the first equation with our circled information. Let's see what that looks like. So we end up with -4x plus 8 equaling 10x minus 6. Okay, let's begin solving for x. Let's see what we get. So I'm going to add 4x to both sides of the river, giving me 8 equals 14x minus 6. I'm going to add 6 to both sides of the river, giving me 14 equals 14x. And finally, I'm going to divide by 14 on both sides of the river so that 1 equals x. I'm not going into a whole lot of detail in that solving process. I'm hoping that you're a master at that by this point. Okay, now that we know what x is equal to, let's go solve for y. And this is new for us. So step 4 says that we're going to replace the x in the circled equation with the value that we just found. and then we will use that information to solve for y. Let's see what that looks like. That's going to give us y equals -4 times 1 plus 8. So, order of operations, let's go solve for y. -4 times 1 is -4 plus 8. Y ends up equaling +4. Hey, we're ready to write out our final answer, which will always be in the format of x and then y, regardless of which variable you solve for first. We learned that x has a value of 1 and y has a value of 4. Therefore, our final answer is the coordinate point 1, 4. And there you go. Example 4. We're going to solve using substitution the system of x plus 3y equals -4 and -7x minus 6y equals -17. In the introduction, step 1, we said we need to determine which equation is solved for a variable, either x equals or y equals. We also said that if neither equation is solved for a variable, you got to get one there. So let's start that process now. Neither of these equations are solved for either x or y. So you look and you say, hey, of these 4 variables, x and y on the top, x and y on the bottom, which one of these 4 is the least scary looking? That's what you ask. And honestly, I would say that this x right here is the least scary looking variable. So as a result, we are going to take this equation and solve for x because it's the least scary, most friendly to find. And for this particular equation, all you have to do is subtract 3y on both sides of your river so that x ends up equaling -3y minus 4. Now we have an equation that is finally solved for a variable. And we, just like in the introduction and previous problems, circle its equation part. And then we say for step 2 that we are going to replace that variable in the other equation with this circled piece of information. So let's see what that looks like. We see that we will have an equation of -7 minus 3y minus 4 minus 6y equals -17. Okay, let's begin the process of solving for y. We're going to distribute the -7 through the parentheses so that we have +21y plus 28 minus 6y equals -17. We're going to combine like terms. 21y minus 6y gives us 15y plus 28 equals -17. After subtracting 28 on both sides of the river, we find that 15y happens to equal -45. And finally, by dividing by 15, we have an end result of y equaling -3. Excellent. Truthfully, that was the hard work. We've done the hard part. Let's go finish this off. Now that we know what y is equal to, -3, we're going to use that by plugging it back into our circled equation so that we can solve for x. Let's see what that looks like. X equals -3 times the y value of -3 minus 4. Solve for x. -3 times -3 is +9, minus 4, x equals +5. We have our final needed value. Let's go write our final answer. Of course, it's in the order of x and then y, regardless of which variable you found first. X had a value of 5, y had a value of -3, and as a result, The solution to our system of equations is the point 5, -3. And there you go. In our fifth and final example, we're going to solve this system of equations using substitution, where -7x plus 5y equals 6 and x plus y equals -18. We see in this particular example that neither of our equations are solved for a variable. Oh no, except it's not that bad. So we look to say, hey, which equation, which variable is the least scary? And we have so many equations that truthfully we find very comfortable, where y equals is the least scary. So let's solve this second equation for y by subtracting x on both sides of the river, so that as a result, y is equal to -x minus 18. Okay, so now we have done step 1, where we found the equation that is solved for a variable because we created it. And now we can go ahead, circling its equation part, and prepare to substitute into our other equation for its variable. Let's see what that's going to look like. With the substitution, we see -7x plus 5 times the quantity of -x minus 18 equals 6. Great. Let's begin the process of solving for x. -7x plus, well, actually we're going to distribute this 5 through the quantity. So a positive 5 times a -x is a -5x. And then positive 5 times -18 is -90, which equals 6. Great. Combining like terms, -7x minus 5x is -12x minus 90 equals 6. Adding 90 to both sides of the river, we have -12x equals 96. And finally, we divide by -12 on both sides, so that x ends up having a value of -8. Excellent. Fantastic. Okay, now we can use that information to go ahead and solve for y. From the introduction, we saw that once you found the value for one of your variables, you're going to substitute that into your other equation, your circled equation, and solve for the remaining variable. So let's do that right now. That means that we are going to have y equals negative times -8 minus 18. Well, a negative times a negative is a positive 8 minus 18. Thus, y is equal to -10. We've done all the hard work. We're ready to write our final answer. So, our solution is always a coordinate point in the order of x and then y, regardless of what you solve for first. For us, x has a value of -8 and y has a value of -10. So we have the coordinate point, -8, -10. And there you go.